This skirt was never meant to be. Okay, perhaps that's a bit overdramatic. Maybe I should rephrase. I didn't plan to make this skirt. Hello friends, I'm Shannon Makes, historical costumer by day, circus artist by night, and it has been 2 years that I've had this channel, and this will be the first skirt I've sewn. Well, maybe the second if you count the skirt portion of my Cuban Pete Gunny Saxoween mashup from last year, but either way, it seemed about time to add an actual daily wear skirt to my wardrobe. It wasn't in my ever-growing list of projects to make, but the discovery of a little more than a yard of gorgeous gray-black wool in my local thrift store, combined with an upcoming date with friend and history-bounding hobbit Angela of Demi-Pint Creations, meant that suddenly I was struck with the overwhelming desire to make something for our upcoming adventure, and with only 2 days in which to sew it, a skirt seemed the most reasonable option. But the tricky part was the yardage. I had roughly 1.25 yards to work with, which basically eliminated anything like the typical Keystone walking skirt. Plus, if we're being honest, do we really need to see yet another walking skirt video? I certainly didn't feel like I had much new information to contribute to that conversation, so I fast-forwarded 15 years to this drafting manual from 1911. Yes, that's right, I had 48 hours to sew a skirt, and I decided that I should draft it from scratch. Given my previous experience drafting garments from period manuals, and everywhere else, when it says half the waist or half the knee, it means half the waist or half the knee. Was that really the wisest plan? Perhaps not, but that's what I did. Much like the making of the skirt, the filming of this video was very spur of the moment and potentially a bit slapdash, so let's enjoy some chaos together. Like I said, I chose a drafting manual from 1911 because the silhouette was slimmer, skirts were less voluminous than in previous decades, and I was basically looking for a simple gored skirt because I knew that would probably be the best and most efficient way to use as much of my yardage as possible. I settled on this 5 gored underskirt, which consisted of 1 center front panel cut on the fold, 2 side gores, and 2 back gores. Because my history with drafting patterns has been, well, hit or miss, I went through all the instructions first and worked out all the math just to make sure that I understood the process and that there weren't any glaring errors in the instructions. And I thought I had everything worked out, although that wasn't quite the case, as we'll see in a bit. I had all the figures calculated and had even written them down on the sample sketch provided in the manual, and the first 2 panels went together without a hitch. But when I went to draw up the back gore, I immediately noticed things were looking a little funny. The angles were all wrong, and upon closer inspection, the back hip measurement, which is supposed to be larger than the hip measurement on either of the other 2 panels, was way too small, resulting in a back panel that looked way narrower than on the sample illustration. I went back and triple-checked my numbers, reread all of the instructions, and everything seemed right, yet somehow my panel was wrong. Then I examined the sample measurements given and realized exactly what the problem was. The imaginary human being whose measurements were given in the sample draft had a hip-to-waist ratio that was far off from my own. I'm not sure if it was just because the drafting instructions assumed that the model would be wearing a corset, or if it's just that my athletic build and low ribcage prevent a period-typical amount of squishage. It's probably a combination of both, but once I compared the sample hip-to-waist ratio to my own, I was able to adjust the pattern accordingly and redraft the back panel. I'm not going to go into the actual drafting instructions here, but if you'd like me to go through it step by step and also talk about how I adjusted the pattern to account for my own measurements and ratios, let me know and maybe we can make that happen in a separate video. So the main pattern was drafted and could then be cut out, and I opted not to do a mock-up because I was 1, very sure of my math, and 2, because I only had a couple days to get this skirt together. That may be a lot for some people, but I'm annoyingly meticulous and often slow myself down. I laid my panels out on my fashion fabric to make sure they would all fit on my yardage, and if you can't tell, I'm really enjoying having a pinnable work surface. If you weren't here for my sewing table build, where I constructed this table from mostly recycled scraps and fitted it out with this fancy pinnable surface, it'll be linked up in the corner. But anyways, while I had more than enough room on my fabric for my pattern, I realized that I wanted a front yoke, so I quickly modified the front and side panels. At this point, I didn't have a specific image as inspiration, I was just sort of winging it. I also cut all the panels out of this IKEA bedsheet, salvaged from the trash pile of a local laundromat, because I wanted to flatline the skirt. I then started to baste the two fabrics together just to serge around each panel, but then I decided, why not do my new favorite seam finish, the flatlining and Hong Kong finish all in one. I went over this in some detail in my Hobbit cape video from last week, so go check that out if you want some more details on the process. Was this the smartest decision given how little time I had for this project? Let's just call that a rhetorical question. I balanced out this questionable decision with another one, which was to eyeball the extra seam allowance on the lining pieces, which basically went against every fiber in my being, but when one is on a time crunch, one needs to get realistic about just how meticulous one needs to be, and I was hoping that this would at least save me a little bit of time. So, just like in the cape, the edges were lined up, pinned down, and sewn together, and then the top and bottom edges were serged. The only side seams that weren't finished with the Hong Kong treatment were the center backs, which I decided to cut on the selvage to eliminate bulk and have a cleaner edge. Once that whole process was done, it looked like this, which I thought was perhaps a bit plain, so I decided to add some flat piping to the front yoke to make it stand out. So I pulled out some thin black suiting wool, which you might recognize from my fabric warehouse tour, and which is ultimately destined for my 1890s Dread Pirate Roberts cosplay, but we're gonna steal just a little section here to zhuzh up the skirt. I cut out a few thin strips, which were then ironed in half and were ready to be attached to the front yoke. Except that the yoke was still in 3 pieces, so I quickly attached the front and side gores into one top yoke and one bottom panel. If you're enjoying the video so far, please consider giving it a thumbs up, and if you'd like to leave me a tip, I do have a Ko-fi account where monthly supporters get access to bonus materials like monthly vlogs, project sneak peeks, and extra corgi content. I greatly appreciate your support, whatever form it may come in. Then the flat piping could be attached to the yoke. I basted it in place by hand, then lined up the yoke on top of the bottom panel where it would be top stitched in place to keep the nice point of the V intact. This was again basted on by hand and then sewn down by machine. As you can see, the light is waning and I was approaching the end of the first day of sewing, so I left my pieces to hang overnight and potentially stretch out, and I came back to pick them up in the morning. That evening, as I lay in bed, I browsed Pinterest and looked for inspiration for some additional embellishments, because I felt the skirt was just a bit plain. And the 1910s and teens had some fantastic and, let's just say, unique pocket designs. And fancy pockets are, after all, very much my style. Many options were found, but I settled on these pockets mainly because the rest of the image looked similar to my skirt. I started the next day by looking for some buttons, and I actually found 6 perfect leather-covered buttons in my button jar, which I pinned in place to test out the look, and I loved it. What I didn't love was the back panel. The instructions were to take a pleat on either side, but that just looked horrible and resulted in a strange, billowy bubble butt sort of situation, and no matter how I rearranged the pleats, I couldn't get them to sit any nicer, so I decided that those needed to be darts instead. Perhaps not as period accurate, but far more attractive. I pinned some darts in place, discovered that they were slightly too big, repinned them, and made some notes of the modifications. Then the back panels were unpinned so the darts could be cleaned up and sewn down. The darts were also marked on the pattern paper just for posterity and potential future skirts. I decided to do the placket next because it'd be easier to do while the panels were flat and free-floating. I drafted a panel that gave a finished placket of 8 inches long and 1 inch wide, then attached it to one of the back panels. My choice of seam finishes meant that I actually didn't need a second placket. I could just fold the center back seam under and use it without a placket. Then I decided I wanted to avoid the bulk of turning under both edges of the placket, so instead I left it unfolded and raw and used some black twill tape to cover that edge. Next, the sides were pinned together and sewn to the back, but not before adding in some gigantic pockets. This is the pocket pattern from the 1890s bike bloomers, and they are just huge. I also made sure to cut the top of the pocket tall enough so that the entire pocket bag could be captured in the waistband. No measly twill tape extensions for this girl, I've got too many snacks. The drafting manual gave instructions for where to mark the pocket openings, although I did verify that that placement worked for me before attaching them. Then the pockets were sewn onto the main skirt panels, and the pocket bags joined by serging around the edges, and then the rest of the side seams could be sewn up. One of the tricks I like to use to keep my pocket bags behaving properly is to press all of the seams to the front of the skirt, the direction in which the pocket will sit in the final garment, and then understitch the pocket bag to the side seams to make sure that the pocket can't easily be pulled inside out. With the body of the skirt finished, I turned to those fancy front pockets. I cut a sample pocket out of some scrap fabric to test the design on a smaller scale, and when the concept seemed sound, I went ahead and drafted a full-sized pattern. The fabric was cut out, the edges ironed under, and the top edge trimmed with more of that same black wool. The main problem I had with the pockets, and I will admit that I spent way more time on these than I should have, was that the top edges, which in the image are crisp and properly gathered into neat, evenly spaced wrinkles, were looking rather limp and aimless in my version. I thought that maybe pinning the folds to that middle band would help add some structure and order, which it did to a degree, but the pockets still looked a bit flaccid. No matter what I tried, I was unable to get them to behave, and I nearly scrapped them then and there, but I decided to keep them on and see how I felt about them in the morning, and in the end, I'm glad I did. Then, with my morning hike fast approaching, I spent the evening on the finishing touches, attaching by hand the buttons, the pockets, and the hem trim. Off camera, because I'd lost the light, I cut out a waistband from the scant scraps of my fabric. Because this isn't an 1890s walking skirt, there was no need to use a twill tape waistband. Skirts from this period were often worn with the blouse or shirtwaist tucked in, making the waistband visible, so thin twill tape was out and a more substantial and visually appealing fashion fabric waistband was in. This was interfaced, sewn on by machine in the front, then folded over and the edges whipped down by hand on the inside. We're just going to leave me there, sewing on into the night and losing a few hours of sleep trying to wrap up the skirt, while we sit here and reflect on the process and the outcome before the final reveal. The process went relatively smooth, at least compared to my other drafting experiences, but that's honestly probably because skirts are fairly simple garments in general. There were definitely some adjustments that I had to make to the pattern to accommodate its use on a modern body, namely one that is not only not corseted but also fairly athletic, but they were pretty easy adjustments, and instead of having a frustrating process, I actually found it both interesting and really informative. In the end, because I stuck as strictly as possible to the manual's instructions, I wound up with about 11 inches of unused width left on my fabric that I really wish I had incorporated into the skirt. That's to say that I wish the hem was 11 inches wider around because I really prefer the wider, more flowing skirts, and this is just at the lower limit of what I want to wear hem-wise. That fabric didn't go to waste, or rather it did because I cut it up to form the waistband of the skirt, but if I could go back and do it again, I'd find another solution for the waistband and I'd put that fabric in the body of the skirt. The back placket, which I did in perhaps a slightly untraditional manner due to my choice of seam finishes, turned out really nice and sits really smooth. Although I do think I'll go back and move the eyes slightly because you can see the very edges of them peeking out right at the center back seam. I did end up attaching the pockets, figuring worst case if I hated them, I could always take them off, and while I was definitely on the fence about them until I got the genius idea to add a thin wire into the binding at the upper edge, which I used to help that edge hold its shape, and that significantly improved the look and made it look much more like the inspiration image, and in the end, I think I really kind of dig the quirkiness that they bring, plus having more pockets is never a bad thing. If I could go back in time, there are certainly a couple things I'd change. Besides widening the hem, I'd make that V-shaped upper front panel out of one piece of fabric instead of three. I'm not sure why I didn't think of that sooner, and I'd also attach it to the rest of the skirt in a slightly different manner, but those are relatively minor changes that would only eliminate a bit of bulk, but they wouldn't really change the overall look of the skirt. I do really like the balance of the black trims and buttons that I added on. You'll see it here in just a second, I promise, but I think it's just the right amount of contrast to the gray herringbone, and while I was pretty skeptical about the dress as I was making it up, wearing it all day and walking around in it really made me warm to it, and I think I'll definitely keep it and get some good use out of it. Or maybe I'll find a similar fabric and remake it, but with a wider hem, in which case this version will probably wind up in my coffee store. Anyways, that's enough of me talking. Let's take a look at the final reveal. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know down in the comments whether this was worth the 2-year wait or if I should stick to the pants and bathrobes. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you in the next one.